Hello everyone and welcome back to Clinical Cousins YouTube channel. Today we're going to go over how the body sends sympathetic messages to target tissues and affected organs. So first we need to know some quick terminology. So I've taken one slice of this and I've put it over here so that we can better understand it. So a pre-G neuron, shown here in black, or a preganglionic neuron, has its cell body in the spinal cord and an axon that stretches to our ganglia. So the ganglia, shown here in green, is basically just a cluster of neuron cell bodies that are located in the peripheral nervous system. So in simple terms, this is like a meeting place for our message carriers. Specifically, it is where the pre-G and post-G neurons meet. So it makes sense that the neuron that comes after a ganglia is called a post-ganglionic neuron, which is shown here in red, and basically it's just a neuron that has its big cell body in the ganglia, but it has its axon that reaches out to the target tissue or the organ. So basically, the part of the body that we're trying to influence is the target tissue. So the first thing that we need to know about the sympathetic or the fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system is that the neuron cell bodies of sympathetic nervous system neurons are located in the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord. So this means that the first neurons to start the message chain have their big cell bodies in the spinal cord. Now, where specifically do they have their origins? Where is the start of the sympathetic message chain? Well, specifically, this is from our T1 to L3 vertebrae. So let's see what happens when, let's say, we see a bear in the middle of the night and all of a sudden this bear turns its head toward us and starts moving toward us slowly. So our sympathetic nervous system is going to be going crazy. It's going to have lots of influence in our body. So what happens? Well, first, our neuron cell bodies from the sympathetic nervous system, remember, T1 to L3, will start to fire action potentials in their axons shown here. So these pre-G neurons shown here in black will release acetylcholine into receptors which are located on the post-G neurons. So remember that the ganglia are just a meeting place for neurons, specifically our pre-G and our post-G neurons. So the axons of these pre-G neurons will release acetylcholine onto nicotinic 2 receptors which are located on the cell bodies of our post-G neurons. So these sympathetic post-G neurons have acetylcholine receptors called N2 receptors that allow the influx of cations into the cell. Basically, these pre-G neurons are whispering an acetylcholine message and these post-G neurons are listening. All of this is happening in the ganglia. So these sympathetic post-G neurons eventually become depolarized themselves and will fire action potentials down their long axons, which are eventually connected to our target tissues and organs. So these post-G neurons release norepinephrine onto our adrenergic receptors, which we'll learn about this in later videos, but basically these are our alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, and beta-2 receptors that are sensitive to norepinephrine and are directly responsible for the different sympathetic actions that we see in our tissues and organs. So for now, we should know that these post-G neurons are a little different than the ones that we're used to seeing. So these neurons have what are called varicosities. So what is a varicosity? We've heard of varicose veins, but what is a varicosity? Basically, it's like a beaded string. So these are like long beads that basically lace themselves over the tissues that they are trying to influence. This helps increase the surface area, and if we increase the surface area, we know that we are going to activate more receptors. So this is a very smart thing that our body has evolved to do. So there are many varicosities which release neurotransmitters when they are depolarized. So this is kind of like how Christmas lights work. So imagine a long string of lights that releases neurotransmitters when it is turned on. So if you're interested, there are a few specific ganglia that would be very, very good to know because they're involved in the innervation of some pretty important parts of our body. So remember that a ganglia is just where the pre-G and post-G neurons meet. So what are a few of the most important ones? Well, the superior cervical ganglion is responsible for the dilation of our lens and for innervating our salivary glands, for increasing our heart rate. And if we move down just a little bit, the celiac plexus, remember celiac, think stomach, works to slow down our stomach and small intestine motility. The superior mesenteric plexus, if we move down just a little bit, works to slow down our small intestine and large intestine motility. And lastly, if we move down just a little bit more, our inferior mesenteric plexus works to slow down the motility in our rectum, and it also innervates the male genitalia. So a very, very cool thing about the sympathetic nervous system, it's kind of unique and very, very important, is that we have to remember the adrenal glands. So specifically the middle part of the adrenal glands, which is called the adrenal medulla. So this adrenal medulla, it sits on top of our kidneys. So if we have a kidneys shown here, kind of sits on top of our kidneys, and it's also a part of the sympathetic nervous system. So the cool way that our body kind of activates the adrenal medulla is that it uses pre-G neurons to release acetylcholine onto N2 receptors on the adrenal medulla, so that the adrenal medulla will directly release epinephrine and norepinephrine into our bloodstream. So it's the same process as earlier, except instead of having a post-G neuron, this releases epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into our bloodstream. So how is it able to do this? Well, it's able to do this because the adrenal medulla has cortisol and all of the enzymes necessary in the biogenic amine pathway to synthesize epinephrine from norepinephrine. So this adrenaline, this epinephrine, will circulate and activate adrenergic receptors all throughout the body. So what have we learned here today? We learned that the sympathetic nerve cell bodies, the pre-G neurons, are in the spinal cord at the levels of T1 to L3. These pre-G neurons release acetylcholine onto nicotinic 2 receptors, which are located on the post-G neuron cell bodies. These post-G neurons release norepinephrine through beaded varicosities that are laced over the target tissues, which are lined with our adrenergic receptors, which are just waiting for that norepinephrine so that they can do their job. So the end result manifests itself as what? We'll have dilated pupils, we'll have sweating, we'll have a dry mouth, we'll have increased heart rate, dilated bronchioles, our airways are dilated, we'll have slightly slower GI motility and function, and lastly, we're going to have an increase in blood glucose and epinephrine concentration from the actions in our adrenal medulla. So in other words, we are ready to fight or to run away from that bear. As always, thank you for taking the time to learn with us today, and remember to like and subscribe for more content.